This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Hello, everybody who has joined us. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for doing all of the technical support today and for getting us set up and for making sure that the meeting, the webinar here gets recorded. So we are here today. My name is Casey Conlin. I am the Library Sustainability Coordinator for the Mid-Hudson Library System, and we're here to go over the State Aid for Library Construction Program, or the Construction Grant as it is commonly known. This webinar here is an overview of the grant and what's involved in it. There's a second webinar that we'll do because of some of the social distancing and stay-at-home orders that have been put in place, which is a technical support webinar where we'll go over in more detail actually applying for the grant and the paperwork that's involved in that. But here we're going to give you an overview of the grant, what you have to do just at a higher level, and what's involved to see if this is something that you could actually go out for this year, and for you to know what kind of support there is available from Mid-Hudson. We're always here to answer your questions. We have a couple of scheduled times that we can actually help you directly with the grant, but anytime that you want to ask a question, we're always available for that. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is just a little background on the grant. So this grant, which is not actually a grant, it's state aid. It is in the state budget, but it's actually bonded money. So it's not actually in the budget. It's money that the state bonds for, the dormitory authority of the state of New York bonds for. If you hear us talk about DASNY, that is who that is, and they are in charge of this grant. If we come to you as we get down the road with this grant, if you apply and we say DASNY said this, or DASNY would like to see this in your grant, that's who we're talking about. And they have a pretty final say on what goes on with the grants and what we can ask for in the grants and what they want to see in the grants. So below DASNY, we have DLD, Division of Library Development, also known as the State Library. And there are a number of people at the State Library who also review the grants along with the Dormitory Authority and Mid-Hudson to make sure that the grants that you're putting in for are programs that are eligible according to the laws and regulations that make this state aid possible for library construction. So we work with DLD very closely to make sure that all our grants are good. All the grants that come from our member libraries are in line with what they expect to see, so that we can make sure that you get as much funding as possible. And also, one of the benefits of this is that if there is extra money, or if there are library systems who find that they can't do a project later on in the year, because we work so closely with DLD and because we make sure that all of the applications that we put in are good applications, a lot of times we'll be eligible to receive that additional funding, which we can distribute to our library's projects. So we work very closely with DLD, and they charge us with doing things like this and doing a little bit of hand-holding and doing a little bit of guidance on what you can apply for and what your paperwork should look like and what it should say. So that's where this comes in. You see, they charge the 23 public library systems, of which Mid-Hudson is one, with figuring out how to get the best grants possible up to DLD. So the amount of money available this year is 14 million. Last year we had 34, but it was knocked down to 0 for this year briefly. So we're happy to have it back up at 14 million. And the Mid-Hudson portion should be about $500,000, $525,000 that we have available to distribute this year to libraries and library projects. The minimum grant award to keep in mind here is $2,500, and this is a matching grant. So the total project cost of the smallest project that we can fund through this grant aid is $5,000. So we want to do projects of all kinds. It can go much bigger than that, and we've had very big projects that come through this. But if you're thinking about a project and it's not going to hit that $5,000 mark, the amount of work that you have to put into this program is probably greater than the return. And it's also a legal stipulation that we can't do a project that's smaller than this amount here. So the next thing to talk about is the timeline. And the timeline can be a little bit confusing. This grant runs for a 3-year period, and your project has to be done by June 30th, 2023 if you're applying this year in 2020. And it seems real far out, right? It seems like no problem. How can I, I have so much time to get this done. But we do find libraries, you start working with contractors, you're trying to get stuff done, and that time sneaks up on you, especially when we consider some of the timeline for when you actually find out about this funding and when you'll receive these funds. So this is a tighter timeline, and this is for the 1 year period that we're looking at right now, which is probably what most of you are thinking about. I think you're all probably thinking about, all right, when am I going to apply? When do I have to get all this paperwork done? And then when do I get my money, right? So looking at the timeline, May 29th, the construction needs and intent to apply memo is due. This was an action memo that went out to all library directors, and all library directors are supposed to reply to this and fill it out, whether they're completing a construction project or will apply for a construction project this year or not. Response to this helps us gauge the need in the state and in our system and helps us plan a little bit for the future, but we'll go over the construction needs memo a little bit more in a minute. In mid-June, the online application will be available. You'll be able to log in. It's not a for certain date yet, but sometime in mid-June, historically, you can log in and you can start doing your paperwork and uploading all the things that you need to do. In May through August, early August, we will be providing you with support. Mid-Hudson will be supporting you. You can see June 18th, we have the Technical Assistance Workshop, and that's where we'll go over the paperwork that you need for this grant in detail and help you fill that out. If you're frantically copying down that link, I want to assure you that there will be an email to everybody who registered for this webinar and everybody who's at the webinar after the webinar, and we'll have the recording of the webinar as well as all the slides. So you can just click the link right there and you can go and register if you plan on pursuing this grant this year. In May and July, we'll also have office hours, and essentially that means you can meet with me, likely virtually for the next couple of weeks at least, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, whether you have a question about the application or a specific piece of the application or your project that you want to apply for and whether it's eligible. And so just keep in mind that this August 7th date does creep up very fast. I know it seems far off, but August 7th is not that far away, especially when we consider all the things that we have to get in for this application. And especially if you consider, what we have going on this year with stay-at-home orders and just in general what happens in June and September or June and July, right? Like it's always hard to get stuff done in June and July. And so we call for you to submit this on August 7th because we have to get all your paperwork processed, make sure everything is in order so that we can submit it to our incentives committee, the Mid-Hudson Library System Board of Trustees Incentive Committee, who will vet and rank your applications and submit them to the MHLS board for approval of the recommended award amounts. And then in early October, we have to get all the applications that you put in into DLD. So we want to make sure we get everything into DLD on time. Remember, DLD makes a lot of decisions about recommended award amounts and what can go in. So we want to make sure that we get what they need to them on time. And then I'm sorry that this window is so wide, but to find out when you actually receive the award, we'll let you know right after the Board of Trustees meeting what the recommendations are for your award. But to actually receive official notification from the state library is supposed to happen in June, but we've seen it happening as early as or as late as early September. So that's just something to keep in mind. I know I'm going to get emails from people who are applying, who are on the line today in July and August and probably June too. And people say, hey, did you hear about the money? And I'll say, you know what, I'm sorry, we didn't yet. You'll actually probably know before us because the state will reach out to you directly and tell you, hey, you got this great award. But that is the timeline that you can anticipate for at least the next year of this grant. After you find out about the grant, then you can start, or you can start doing the work before then, but that's when you'll actually find out and you'll start getting your money. You'll see 90% of the award is paid out at that point, usually right after you get the notification, and the final 10% of the grant is paid out after you actually do the work and submit your paperwork that says that the grant has been completed. So here's a little bit more about the action memo. The construction needs action memo. This is what is involved in that. We want to see the top 3 needs that you have at your library and an estimated cost for those needs, for each of those needs. We also want to see a submitted board approved facility plan. And those top 3 needs should fit into your board approved facility plan. Now your facility plan, we have samples up on the website. Essentially, your facility plan tells you what kind of work you plan to do at your library or what kind of work you need to do at your library. Things that are a good example of this are like your roof. Your roof may seem like it never needs to be replaced, but it will need to be replaced eventually. So you're going to want to know when that is, and you're going to want to save some money towards replacing your roof. Likewise, your HVAC system, anything that has a lifespan in your building, you're going to want to have a plan for when you're going to replace it and hopefully putting some money aside to actually replace that. The other thing that the facility plan does is it lines up your projects and tells you what you actually want to do to achieve your goals in serving your community. The facility plan doesn't have to be roofs. The facility plan can be, we really want a children's space so that people can come and enjoy early literacy with their families. That can be part of a facility plan as well. And if indeed you do plan on doing a children's room, as I mentioned a second ago, then we're going to want to see that in your facility plan. Whatever project you apply for this year has to be in your facility plan. So that is part one of the action memo. And those estimated costs, again, those are important for us and for DLD to advocate at the state level for that 14 million that you saw before. We have, you've probably seen stats around Advocacy Day for how much need there is in our communities or how many of our buildings are not completely ADA accessible or not compliant with laws and that everybody can't access our libraries. So we need that information from you and from your directors and from your libraries so that we can advocate for this funding. Again, all libraries are supposed to complete part one. Part two is the intent to apply. And part two is if you plan to apply this year. So if after we get done with this webinar, you're not completely scared off, which I hope you're not. I hope you got a good project. I hope you feel ready to go. You complete the intent to apply. And the intent to apply, you choose the project that you're going to apply for, and then there's a little checklist, which will be pretty reminiscent of the things that we're going to talk about today. So you'll look through that and you'll see that your project meets those things that we're talking about there. Again, this is something your library director should have gotten, and if there's any questions about it, of course, you can reach out to me. All right, so another thing to keep in mind, this is a competitive grant program, so I want you all to do your best. We have the Mid-Hudson Library System Incentive Committee, looks at all the grants that come in and they rank them, the applications based on a couple criteria that we're gonna go over in a little bit. This is necessary because there is not enough funding to meet all the needs of all the construction projects in our system. So we need a way to fairly distribute those funds. So please, do your best on your program, ask me questions. We'll even have a time where we can look over your narrative for you before you should actually submit it, sort of like a little extra credit assignment that you can do if you want, and we'll give you feedback based on what we've seen in the past. But we'll do that in more detail at the technical assistance workshop if you go ahead with applying for this grant. So I said I would share out the slides from this presentation, and it has a lot of resources in it. But I try to maintain a really good list and resources that you can link out to on this website here, midhudson.org/construction. So you can go there, just type this into your browser and you'll be right there. And you'll be able to see a lot of the forms that you'll need for the program and some of the things that you can get started on now, links to those things. So again, the intent of this is to make this as easy as possible for you to access funds through this program to make the best library that you can for your community. So any way that we can make that easier for you and make sure that you have a solid application that goes up to DLD and then up to DASNY, that's what we're trying to do. So you can get as much funding as possible as well. So this is the regulation that tells us the different things that are eligible and ineligible for construction projects. There are some things that are not eligible, but sometimes you can work them in. It's important to note that the eligible and ineligible costs are taken from this regulation, and they're not folks at Mid-Hudson making up these rules. We do set our own priorities, but the regulations of what can be funded are determined in this regulation. And many of them have been translated into the Mid-Hudson priorities. So here is the first group of eligible costs: site acquisition. If you're purchasing new land, or if you're purchasing an existing building to turn into a library or to make into a library building, then this grant is for you. This also includes new construction for a new library building, addition to an existing library building, and we have people on this call who are in the process of doing these things or have done both these things. The other thing that can be covered in this grant is demolition and site preparation. This is kind of a new development that we got last year. I think demolition used to be covered if you had to demo a site, but now if you're going to have demolition involved in your construction program, if it's going to be a phase of that, you're going to want to group it with some kind of actual productive creation of something. It can't be just the removal of something. So you want to make sure that you put that together. And if you're doing a new library building or something very big that's going to involve multiple phases, please talk to us so that we can break it up into good phases that you can get funding for at each juncture. We'll go over some ineligible costs later, and phasing a project properly can make sure you avoid having some part of your project not actually be funded. And the demolition and site preparation is sort of an example of one of the ways that you can do that, just to be smart about that. Here are some more eligible things here. Installation of photovoltaic panels, solar panels, anything that's going to, or most things that are going to improve the energy efficiency of your building. Replacement of roof and windows and doors, that's going to improve the building envelope in most cases, and it's going to lead to higher energy efficiency, which is what makes your project eligible. Reconstruction of existing space is an important one. That's where we'll get into kind of renovations, or if you take some alcove that you have now or some room that's being used for some other purpose and it needs a significant amount of work to create a new space, then we have I think we have somebody on the call who's turned an alcove into a teen room using some of the funds from this project, which is a really cool use of these funds. It makes the library more accessible to a demographic or increases library services. Accessibility is a big word, so making your library accessible to all people in your community is always going to be something that, or is most likely going to be something that can be funded through this grant program and eligible. Likewise, an elevator, if your library has significant stairs that people can't get up, if they're not fully mobily able, then you can get a grant for that through this program. New electrical, plumbing, lighting, and HVAC, that's also something that could be part of many programs, as well as new driveways, sidewalks, and parking lots. That's something that you can get. Usually we try to bring that in under an accessibility point. And new furniture, equipment, and shelving. But it's important to note this last part. As part of a newly configured space, right, or the reconstruction of an existing space. If you want to paint the walls or put down flooring or get furniture, that's not something that you can do standalone. That's something that you're going to need to group as part of a larger project that's actually more construction-y and creates a new space. So here are some more things that we have seen libraries do. If you want to install an emergency generator, that's a good one. That increases the support that you can give to your community in the event of a power outage. Outdoor signage is something that we've seen a couple libraries do. We just had a library apply for this last year and they got the grant. Assistive listening devices and systems for the deaf or hearing impaired. So these are systems that are going to enable people through devices that they already own or devices that you can loan them at the library. They're going to enable these folks who are hearing impaired to actually participate in the library programs that you do. There might be people that are in your community that are left out of your library programs because they don't have the hearing capability to be able to come to your program, but these kinds of systems can allow them to participate. The other thing that you can get reimbursed for on this program is the supervision or management of construction, renovation, or rehabilitation. Any of these programs, if you have a project manager or construction manager or owner's representative, those fees are eligible for reimbursement. Also, if you can bring fiber or broadband to your building, that's something that's been made eligible to increase the capacity, the internet speed of your building, to bring broadband there. And this is relatively new, so we have this in here, is if you have architectural and engineering plans for locally approved new or ongoing projects. So locally approved is important. You can't use this for speculative engineering or architectural plans. These are going to have to be plans that you have in place already. So not eligible, as I mentioned before, routine maintenance, stuff that you should probably be anticipating and saving up for. This is sort of your responsibility as library trustees and library staff to make sure that you have the funds you need to, maintain the basic function of the building. Speculative architectural, we just talked about. If it's something that you're thinking about doing, that is not a cost that's eligible under this program. Building consultant studies would fall in a similar category. Interest or carrying charges on bonds or financing the projects are not eligible, as are mortgage payments are not eligible, or the purchase of books or other library materials. So we talked before about how you can get furniture in there if it's part of creating a new space. The other thing to note is that landscaping is not part of this, but if it were part of redesigning walkways or pathways at your library, then it might be something that we can get in. Just to reiterate, if you have a project that you think might be eligible or might not be eligible, feel free to ask. Now is the time to ask. It's still April, so we do have some time before the deadline. I think it's going to go really fast. It goes a lot faster than you think, I think. But, please, give us a call, send us an email, let us know what you're thinking. Okay. So the Mid-Hudson funding priorities allow us, as mentioned, to prioritize what we can actually, what funds we can allocate. We have limited funds, so we want to decide who can get these funds, and we want to be fair about it. So the incentives committee looks at them based on some criteria. The first one is that you have this board-approved prioritized facility plan. This is a board-approved plan. So if you're on the board, keep this in mind. You have to approve this plan, and it has to be in place so that you can submit it in the action memo. It's possible to submit it after the action memo, but you're cutting it close at that point. Think about when you have board meetings and how frequently you have them. If you miss getting it in by this action memo, which is due on May 29th, then it's going to be a tight turnaround time to get that facility plan drawn up and approved. So if you have questions about the facility plan, please ask me. There's a sample facility plan to get you started on our website at that New York construction grant, or just /construction, and that'll get you there. But please, the first step is to complete the action memo and to do that board approved facility plan and submit that to us. So the next step after you get that board approved facility plan done and the action memo is to make sure that your project meets one of the criteria below. So an increase in services. Increase in services can be an increase in staff efficiency. It could be an increase in square footage. And it could be, anything that increases the services that you can bring to the people in your community. The next point, as we mentioned a few times, is increase in access. Think accessibility. Think, can everybody in your community access your library and get to all the parts of your library and experience your library at the same level? If your project helps improve that, then it will be eligible for that point. Also remember, a little outside the box access is if you can bring a new population, or if you can make the library more accessible to a new population, like the teen room that I mentioned earlier, or the children's room, then you can get a point for this. And you can get more than 1 point on here. The more points you get, the better ranked your project will be and the more funding that you'll receive from the incentives committee. Again, we want to give you funding. We're not trying to withhold it. We understand we're trying to ration it, obviously, because it's a limited amount of funding for a much greater need, but we want to help you out. We want to be able to give you these points. So the other point is energy conservation. Energy conservation is, we'll go over that in more detail in a minute, as well as disaster recovery and leadership in sustainable design. So any project that you can do that's going to increase the energy efficiency of your building is going to get a point for that. And I think much of us, just like in our homes and in our libraries, I think we want to increase the efficiency of our building. It's come to the point now where it doesn't cost a whole lot more to do the smart thing and to spend a little bit more upfront, and you can look at the return on investment of the investment that you're going to make in an energy efficient product or service or just building design, and it'll pay itself off in a little bit or very quickly. We've seen a lot of this in LED light retrofits. There is more money up front, obviously, to replace your light fixtures or your light bulbs, or to replace your bulbs with non-fluorescent bulbs or LEDs. But you can see over the lifespan of a device like that, like an LED fixture or bulb, you'll actually save more money in terms of energy savings and not having to buy new LEDs because they last longer. If your project qualifies or is part of a recommendation from either of these programs on the left side, either a level 2 ASHRAE energy audit, which if you talk to anybody who's going to do an energy audit, they'll be able to tell you more about what's involved in that. But if they recommend that your project, or if your project meets the recommendations that are made by that kind of audit, then you will be eligible for that point. You would submit that energy audit to us, and the piece that says, they should do this with their windows, they should do this to their doors or attic, then you can get that point from the priorities. The other way to get this point, which I'm really excited about and I hope people are taking advantage of, is this NYSERDA Green Jobs, Green Energy program. And so through this program, libraries and small businesses can get very affordable energy studies. The cost of this tops out at $500, and that's for if you have over 50 employees. If you have 10 employees or less, then I think the cost is $100. If you're around 10 or more employees, it's $250, which is very affordable. And they'll give you results that are similar to a level 2 ASHRAE energy audit. The other thing is when you're buying products, over here on the right, we have Energy Star. So you're gonna wanna make sure that any products that you get, whether they're doors or windows or refrigerators or HVAC units, or yes, any kind of HVAC stuff, you're gonna wanna make sure that it has an Energy Star certification and it meets the standards for the useful life energy conservation. So these are ways to get the points for energy conservation, and this is our way of encouraging people to just be smart about doing this, doing the right thing with your money up front and saving a little bit of energy. Yesterday was Earth Day. Hopefully we all were able to celebrate in our stay at home orders, safe social distancing way. But if we can all do our part when we're spending money on building improvements, it can have a long lasting benefit. So this is disaster recovery, and disaster is according to this definition here. I know many things may be considered disaster, but when you approach hyperbole about disaster, that is not what we're talking about here. You can not get the point for that. We have had libraries who were victims of fires for their building, and they had very little forewarning that their building was going to catch on fire, and it had a significant impact and a significant duration of impact. And so these are the factors that we consider when we talk about whether you are experiencing a disaster. So consider these things if you are applying for that disaster point. We'll probably know whether you had a disaster or not, and we'll probably encourage you to apply for this point, but just to be clear about what disaster means. This is the other way to get another point too, is if you go for these LEED or leadership in sustainable design programs. We actually have one library, the Phoenicia Library is a Passive House certified library. I think they were the first library, I don't know if they're the first library in the country or the world, but anyway, they have a Passive House library. The library uses very little energy because it was built with smart building techniques to actually reduce the cost of heating and cooling the building. So if you can do any of these things, then we will be able to give you the point for that priority on the MHLS Incentives Committee funding ranking. If you need more info on this, we have a webinar that goes into more detail about these programs. So to be successful in this program, you have to cross-reference the eligible costs. So think about your project and whether it's one of the costs that we talk about or whether it's an eligible cost under what we talked about before, and then cross-reference that with the funding priorities that we saw a few minutes ago. So if it meets those needs, then you'll be able to have your project funded through this program. If it doesn't meet those needs, then you need to think about, whether this is an appropriate project or whether this is something you have to pay for on your own. The matching funds available, this is something important to remember, and I think sometimes it gets lost in translation, but this is a matching grant program. So you actually have to pay at least half the cost of what your project costs. We will try to give you as much money as possible, but it's very rare very rare. I don't know if it ever happens that we can reach the 50% and fund half of your project. So you have to be ready and you have to have funds in hand to be able to do this project, given how much money we give you. Like I said, there is an opportunity that we will notify you to say, this is how much money we can give you. It's not the full 50%. We can give you 37 or we can give you 40%. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like now. All of this is dependent on how many libraries apply for this program to Mid-Hudson and what kind of projects they're applying for. So just keep that in mind, that you must spend at least half of whatever this project costs. And if you don't have that amount of money, then we're not going to be able to fund your project. And if we think that you might not be able to fund that project, then we might have to talk to you about adjusting your project or maybe not going forward with it until you have the funds in hand. The second option for getting funding through this program is if you meet our criteria for an economically disadvantaged community. And we're going to go over what that criteria is, what it is specifically. And if that's the case, then you may be eligible for up to 75% of your program to be funded. Okay, and then the last one is a relatively new one that we're still feeling out. And I don't know that many libraries would apply for this, but you'd be eligible for up to 90% of your project to be covered. But this is for very economically disadvantaged communities. There's not a lot of libraries that are going to likely qualify for this. So this is the definition of economically disadvantaged. So a political subdivision where 15% of or more of the population is living in poverty, as shown on federal census data. So if you go and you look this up and you find that your community has 15% or more of the population living in poverty, then you would grab some of that documentation and you would submit that with your application. And then we can consider funding your project up to 75%. The next criteria, the next possible criteria that you could qualify for is if 40% or more of the children in your library's school district qualified for free or reduced school lunch. So if that happened, then you would grab that documentation, you can put it in your application. And the final way to do it is a combination of both of them. And so if 10% or more of your population is living in poverty and 30% or more of the children in your school district are eligible for free or reduced school lunch, then you can qualify for this 75% match, or the 25% match, as an economically disadvantaged community. The relatively new program is this 90-10 match, and I'm going to review it here, and you can look and see if your library might be eligible. Again, we did a quick look and we didn't see a lot of our libraries that would be eligible for this, but it's essentially if your library is above the average poverty rate for New York State based on census data, and the state library has said specifically that they will judge that requirement, that's not something for us to do at home. So if that's something that you think that you qualify for, then please let us know and we'll get in touch with DLD to get this whole process moving to make sure that you can qualify for this. The application must contain documentation demonstrating how the project will address service needs for economically distressed communities. So, this is something part of your application too. You'd have to write into your narrative how you're going to help, an economically distressed community. The other thing is you have to be able to demonstrate that there's some reason that your library can't meet the 25% that's part of the 75% match. So you have to be able to meet all those requirements, and then you would be eligible for the 90-10 match. But it's important to remember the last part here, which is no more than 10% of the money that we have been given as Mid-Hudson to allocate can go to one of these 90-10 match programs. So we will have about $52,000 to put towards a 90-10 match program. So this is a new thing and we'll be figuring this out. And if you have questions about this or you think you might qualify, then you can email me and we can explore it a little bit more because it is new. So I talked about this earlier. it's very likely that you're not going to get the full 50%. And just keep in mind too that it is only 50%. That's the highest it could go, and it probably will not be at 50%. And you have to have funding to pay for the rest of the project. So give us a call if you're thinking about this or if you were expecting to get something different. I know sometimes people think that this is a grant program that might pay for the entirety of your construction program, and that's not really the case. And again, after the board has approved the recommendations that we come up with based on your applications in the incentives committee, we'll come to you and we'll say, okay, look, this is how much money we can provide. Can you still do the project with this much funding? Can you make up the difference of whatever we couldn't provide for you in this program? And so you'll have an opportunity at that point to say, you know what, we can't do it at that much. We were hoping to get more. We don't have enough to do it. Or you can adjust the scope of your project. So you will have the opportunity, but just keep in mind that we may not get you to a full 50%. So when you're fundraising or looking for money or finding money in your accounts, keep this in mind, or saving up your money, keep this in mind that it will likely be more than 50% that you'll have to pay towards the project. All right, so here's a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts about spending for the project to keep in mind. So the grant program starts on July 1st, and expenditures made after July 1st, 2020, so that's in the future, right? And that's a little bit before the application is due. Expenditures made before July 1st or after July 1st are eligible for reimbursement in this program. If you make expenditures between January 1st of this year, 2020, and June 30th, then that can count as part of your matching funds. Again, remember, you have to pay for half of this program, so that might count as some of your matching funds. And there's accounting to do at the end of the program, which is pretty straightforward to get your last 10%. And you'll see about matching funds there in more detail. But if you have spent any money this year on this project, it can be possibly eligible for matching funds, to count as your matching funds. Nothing that you spent before January 1st, 2020 can be included in matching funds or eligible expenditures to get reimbursed through this grant program. So here's another look at the timeline. Just keep in mind, we're gonna look at some of the paperwork in a second. Keep in mind that this August 7th date is that's the date, that's the drop dead date. And I know a lot of people on this call, and a lot of people are like, Casey's really cool, he's really chill. I bet, if I email him and I'm on vacation or something, I bet I can get it in like August 15th or something. It's fine, it's Casey, right? We can't extend this deadline here. This is a deadline, and this is the deadline. So please have it done by this date, okay? And last year I was here and I watched folks go through the program, and it snuck up on them real fast, this August 7th date. And bear in mind that we do have a lot more going on this year in terms of things that will slow us down, these stay-at-home orders that we're seeing. Just even in a good year, I think it's hard to get all the stuff in line that you need to get in line. So allow yourself more time than you would have perhaps in previous years. So we said there was a lot of stuff involved in the application. So this is the application checklist. And again, we'll go over this in more detail in the technical support workshop, which we're going to do. Application form is actually pretty easy. There's a couple of questions on there that you fill out online. The narrative, that's part of the application form. I'm just going to highlight again these, the contractor quotes. If you're thinking about getting a project and you have an architect, or you have, you've done your own spreadsheet and you've Googled it, that's not going to work as a support document for this application. You're going to have to actually get a quote from a contractor on their letterhead. And I know it's a pain in the neck, but it's also not cool when you get to the project and it costs way more than you thought it was going to be. So try to get a really good quote for this. If you can, get 3 quotes just so you know what it'll actually cost. Because again, we're going to give you some funding, and you have to spend this funding. You can't give this money back if you find out next year that you can't do this program. It's not really an option. If you end up giving the money back to us, then we have to give it back to DASNY, and then that puts pressure on us because in future years, when we say, hey, we need funding for libraries, they'll say, well, you guys had to give this money back these years. So it's really not a great situation when we're not actually able to do what we want to do, you're not actually able to do the projects that you committed to do. So please, be good about those contractor quotes, and make sure you get them, make sure they're accurate, and just so you know what you're actually going to have to pay for these things. Certification of available funds. This is, it could be a bank statement. Additional funding sources. One thing to keep in mind, if you're looking at SAM funds are a great way to get additional funding for your project. SAM funds come from your state legislator, and they can help you out with a significant amount of money to your project, but that money cannot be used as match funds. And we've seen a couple libraries get called in by DASNY, and they want to make sure, they say, all right, you got a SAM grant and you got this grant from Mid-Hudson and DLD and DASNY. We want to see what those projects paid for, because those are supposed to be different projects. So if you do get a SAM grant, that's amazing. Just please give us a call and we'll make sure that you're not doing the same projects, and you don't get in any trouble or have to give any of that money back. So certification of a lease, and that is if you don't own your building, you'll need a certification from the lease, certification and a lease that shows that you'll be in the building for the next 10 years. Keep in mind, we don't want to invest in a project, not we, but DASNY doesn't want to invest in a project that won't be a viable library project in 10 years. If you're a school district library, you may need Office of Facilities Planning approval. SHPO is a state historic preservation office, and if your building is more than 50 years old, which isn't that long ago these days, you think of historic preservation, you think of some ancient old building, but it's not that long ago at this point. Some stuff that was built 50 years ago is pretty new seeming still. So you're going to want to have to get that, and SHPO documentation can take up to 30 days to get back to you, and that's in years when we don't have stay-at-home work orders in place. These CEIF forms aren't so bad. They'll look real bad. If you're intimidated by any of these documents, please give me a call. I'll give you a pep talk. You'll get through it. Smart growth form likewise is okay. The FS10 forms are always fun. We joke around about how they have to be signed in blue ink. The payee information form and substitute W-9, again, all really fun things that we'll talk about at the technical workshop. And then the assurances document, which essentially assures that your project is eligible and that you're going to do what you said you were going to do with the funds, and that's signed off on by the board. And pre-construction photographs. So, sort of a before and after. They want to see, DLD and DASNY want to see what you did with the money. So you take these photos beforehand, and then you actually upload post-project photos after. And so you can see, oh wow, look at that. Look how nice it looks now. So things to do right now, to reiterate, project bid and quote figures. Again, your architect's estimates are not going to work. Also, we had a question about engineers' estimates at one point. Those are not going to work either. We need estimates from people who are actually going to do the work, possibly. And then just to reiterate again, the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, they have 30 days to respond to you, and they may respond, you might not like their response, so it may take some back and forth to ensure that you're able to go through with the project that you want to do the way you want to do it. We had a library last time, and they were able to sort it out, which was great, but yeah, they didn't get the response that they were hoping for from SHPO. Energy audit. I talked to the green energy folks, and you can find that link on our website for the Green Jobs, Green Energy from NYSERDA. And they said they are still doing energy audits through the stay-at-home orders. You do need to have somebody at the library to allow that person in. I think normally you wouldn't be hanging out with that person too much anyway. They go up in your attic and they look all around and they look at your bills. So, start to line that up now. And you can get that done. And then, if your project is part of energy conservation, or maybe you can work with them to let them know what you're planning on doing, and they can give you guidance on that, and you can get that point in the MHLS priorities ranking as part of your energy audit. Register for a New York State Directory Service account. And a New York State vendor ID. These are things that aren't as instantaneous as you might expect if you're used to signing up for like a Netflix account or something. Sometimes these things take days, and I think an actual human being has to verify you and do ththese things. Again, if you go to our construction grant webpage, you can find some links to get you started on that and to make sure that you have it in place. You want to make sure that you have everything that you need to be able to receive the funds, and that you're not held up for some silly reason like you don't have the right account or you lost the password. Also those before photos, as we said, you can be doing that right now. So again, these are some of the resources that we have on our webpage that you can see up here, the midhudson.org/construction. These are always going to be here, and I'll be updating this page a little bit more as the process moves forward with relevant stuff. Sorry. Okay, the other thing that is on that page is we have a couple signups for workshops and office hours. So again, those office hours are where you can talk to me about any of this if it doesn't make sense or you're just frustrated or you just want to chat about construction. I'm available. That is why we have these office hours. They're in half-hour increments and we'll likely talk on the phone for the time being. But maybe if stuff gets lifted, you can come visit me at my office and we can talk. So sign up for those if you like. There's many slots available. And then just the last little note for everybody is just start doing it. Don't procrastinate. The stuff can pile up and becomes more difficult when you don't have as much time. Right now, I'd say we do have a good amount of time, but every day it becomes less so. So if you plan on going for this grant, make sure you have all that stuff in order. If you need help prioritizing the stuff that you're going to do, please, again, call me and I'll help you know what you need to do. We can talk about where you're at right now. So, and this is my contact info if you need to talk to me about any of the things that we talked about or that I've talked about. And we do have time to do questions. And okay. I see we had a question. How recent should contractors' quotes be? So if contractors' quotes are a year old, they may be dated. I don't want to say for sure. I mean, it's a lot of times that we have this project. We saw the timeline before. So the question is, how recent should contractors' quotes be? And I'm sorry, it depends. We've had libraries who go out and they get a quote 1 year, and then they get a quote 1 year as part of this application process, and at that point, they know they're probably still a year away from doing the project because they haven't heard about the funding yet, or whether they'll be eligible. So then they go back to the same person a year later and they say, the same contractor, and they say, all right, what do you think? And that person doesn't want to do it. They have something else going on, and then they have to get quotes from somebody else. So the quote is required of you to make sure that you have an accurate idea of what this will cost to do. And so, again, the more quotes, the better. But if they're a year old, they may be too old. Again, it's not a great place to be where you have the money to do the project, and at that point you're obligated to do the project, and it's not enough money because you didn't ask for enough money, because you didn't know to ask for enough money, because the estimate that you were given was a little too low. Okay, so I saw one question in chat. Are there other questions that anybody has? Okay. So somebody was asking me if they already had a New York State Directory service account. So I would check with the resources on the webpage. You probably already have if you applied last year as this library who's asking this question did, then you likely already have a New York State Directory service account. We have a question. Somebody has foundation structural work that needs to be done before they can renovate the existing building, which will include a new roof. Is this cost eligible? So we'll double check on that. I'll double check on that, Mindy. Okay, I'm gonna make a note of that, and I'll get back to you. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. Kevin wants to know, what criteria does SHPO consider? Sometimes they consider like even aesthetics, but it depends on the environment, like how significantly you're going to alter the building, and they'll have guidance for you on what you can do based on your building and on how, I guess, historically significant your building is, what you can do to it. Sometimes they'll have guidance on, what kind of wires or fixtures that you can use if you're trying to do something indoors, or what you can do to the facade. So there are some questions on the SHPO form, and then they'll get back to you based on what you plan on doing. And then they'll tell you, whether, it meets what they want, or if they want you to do something. And last year we saw a library, they had to document some of the stuff that they were going to be changing significantly as part of their as part of the process of moving forward. So Brian has a question. Does the 50-year requirement include time before the building was owned by the library? And I believe that it does. I believe that, you know, if you took over a very old building, you would still be obligated to talk to SHPO about what you plan to do to that. You know, again, I'm trying to think about if it was a very historically significant building, they would probably want you to talk to them about it. But if it's not a super old building, sorry, if it's not a super old building, then they probably won't have too much to say about it. A lot of times, talking to SHPO is an easy thing. You send in the forms to them and they say, yep, that sounds fine. We're not too worried about this. It's just sometimes that they want to, you know, intervene and give you guidance about what they want you to do or tell you what you can and can't do. The other thing to consider, I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier with SHPO, is if you're disturbing ground anywhere, you're going to want to talk to SHPO also. I think there's a certain radius if you're within the footprint of the building that you don't have to talk to them, but it's not very far out. So if you are disturbing ground, you're going to want to talk to SHPO. And so any other questions? People are welcome to unmute themselves too if they have questions. All right, and we have somebody chiming in. SHPO was the hardest part of the whole process, and they don't move fast. Give them a lot of time. So if they have the follow-up questions, you have time to rebut. Very good. And that's from Daniela. That's a Daniela promise. SHPO is the hardest part. So yeah, so you know, start those SHPO documents now. See what you need to get them in. Sometimes you need plans or at least a decent description of what you're actually planning on doing so that they can make an informed decision and they can get back to you. And yeah, Daniela is who I was talking about before. She had a hard time with SHPO. Usually it's not as tough as Daniela had it, but you don't know and you don't want to find out on in mid-July that they want tons of paperwork from you and that it'll take them a long time to process it if your application is due on August 7th. I'm glad you're all thinking about SHPO. You know, a healthy fear, a healthy respect of you know how long it can take for them, I think is a good place to be. And we'll you know it'll you can make sure that you can make sure that your project is on track and you're not sidetracked by some kind of bureaucratic stuff for SHPO. Any questions you want to ask now are fine. If you have other questions as well, sorry. But yeah, if you have questions after this, I'm happy to answer your questions that way. I have a question. If we did SHPO last year, do they need one for this year's application? I suppose if it was the same project that you were continuing this year, so if you were continuing a project, then you might not need SHPO approval, but you should already know what SHPO needs. I'd have to look at the form more closely, but if you already know what SHPO needs, maybe it wouldn't be too hard to put the project in again. They might even send back something that says we already did this. It's the same project. Okay, then it should probably be okay. You can probably submit the same form. You'll have to submit something, but you can probably submit the same form. But just reach out to me directly. And we'll make sure, and you can send me the form and I can make sure I'm looking at the right form. I'm not sure, somebody was talking to me in private here. I just want to make sure I have all the details so I don't give you a bad answer, okay? Jessica, need help with phasing? Sounds good, Jessica. Give me a call or an email. All right. You're welcome, Jen. Thank you for coming.